So many thanks to Sonic X for the invitation to be here and for the fantastic hosting, and I send my regrets from Liz that she's unable to be here today. What I'd like to offer in the next half hour are two sort of excerpts from projects that we've been working on, sort of set to a soundtrack of my voice, giving some reflections on where we're headed as a practice in response to the Anthropocene. It was what they call in Hollywood the golden hour. We pull up alongside the truck. We watch the light of the sun's nuclear fusion cross paths with the radioactive byproducts of human experiments with nuclear fission. The sun's light illuminates this moving piece of America's nuclear infrastructure. It constitutes a current best attempt to transport and contain the material consequences of human efforts to assemble with and make use of the nuclear force. Many human-made narratives have relegated nuclear waste to the unrelatable. But on a road in New Mexico, we intentionally put our bodies and our media devices into close proximity with a container of transuranic nuclear waste. And momentarily, we moved with it on its way to deep geologic quarantine. In the midst of this event, we felt ourselves dropping out of polarized binaries. We felt that right then, what was appearing before us on our cameras was what was most real about this abject object of the Anthropocene, namely, that it is of us, and we are of it. We humans now travel through time and landscapes with radioactive waste. We and all other living and non-living things commingle in complex and dynamic assemblages with it. Ancient people invented material sightlines into time spans that they otherwise could not comprehend. Stone circles, pyramids, dream time. In 1945, we contemporary humans invented and unleashed a new, vibrant materiality, a sightline into deep time, past and future. When we look at nuclear waste, we look at a thing of our own making in the midst of pulling away from us into deep futures that are beyond our species. We look at a human-made thing that literally bends realities of humans and non-humans around it as it goes. With this video, we acknowledge the eventful, potent existence of this human-made substance, and we bow to our joined trajectories from here. You're watching a 20-minute excerpt from a 3-hour video that we created in 2013. It's entitled Look Only at the Movement. The video is the result of a 12-day research trip that we made in the fall of 2012. On that trip, we drove some of the routes that transuranic nuclear waste travels on US interstate highways. Along the way, we visited some of the storage infrastructures and engineered landscapes that send and receive radioactive shipments. We used a car-mounted video camera to document not only the routes and the sites, but also their larger context, environmental, social, geographical. We visited a low-level waste site, storage called the Energy Solutions Clive facility in Utah. We also visited other research sites, including 2 uranium disposal cells in Utah called Crescent Junction and Mexican Hat. And we also visited a uranium mill tailings remediation site in Moab, Utah. In New Mexico, we visited the Shiprock uranium disposal cell and the waste isolation pilot plant, which is America's only deep geologic repository for transuranic nuclear waste. And we also visited the Los Alamos National Laboratory. In Colorado, we visited Rocky Flats, which is a former plutonium plant, and in our home state of New York, the Knowles Atomic Power Lab. In the past year and a half, several museums and galleries that are located along the official nuclear waste transportation routes have exhibited this project, and they've relayed it from one another and have invited local audiences to participate in discussions around it. The Earth is now wrapped in a layer of fallout from Cold War atmospheric and underground testing, and waste from power plants and other nuclear technologies. Geologists are now contemplating what should count as a signature marker of the Anthropocene in the Earth's strata, and this layer of human-made radioactive material is one of the top candidates. Our project with Look Only at the Movement was to ask, what does it take for human beings to acknowledge what is arguably the most abject and the most enduring byproduct of human history on the planet? What does it take to move in relation to nuclear waste and to address it not as a subject of polarized political discourses, but rather as a vibrant, non-human agent that bends reality around itself? What would happen to hardened and polarizing habits of thinking and talking about the nuclear if we turned toward the bare material fact of radioactive waste? What if we made a humble, partial attempt to stick to this material with our attention and our imaginations as a way to acknowledge the way that it will stick to our species far into geologic futures? For this project, we intentionally chose to make movements of nuclear waste concretely appear for us. We tried to experience its appearance for us through a particular point of view, a point of view located within our own movements, as they entangled with the mobile infrastructures of nuclear waste in and as the American landscape. As we and our camera scanned the horizon for the signature shapes of the shipping containers, we also absorbed the topographical traces of geologic histories that compose the environments around us: the desert, tectonic, suburban, cultivated, and industrialized. Our camera's non-human eye became a collaborator that shaped our human perspective. Its wider than human angle of view puts us and audiences optically inside and more metaphorically enmeshed with the materials and events that we experienced. Halfway through this project, we toured the Department of Energy's Transcom field office in southern New Mexico. Here, 24 hours a day, the staff at this high-security site monitor the movements of satellite-tracked trucks transporting transuranic and high-level waste. On the day that we visited, waste was moving from sites of temporary storage around the country to New Mexico's Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, also known as WIPP. WIPP consists of 6 miles of tunnels at a depth of 1,250 feet, nested within 250 million-year-old salt dome. WIPP's aim is to isolate the waste and humans from the environment for the next 10,000 years. But 1 year ago, after a number of years of accident-free operation, a drum holding plutonium leaked. The leak contaminated 2 of the 6 miles of tunnels and 22 workers. The site might partially reopen in 2016, but it will take years and more than $500 million to fully reopen. So for now, the movement of waste to WIPP has stopped. Despite the topic of look only at the movement, and actually because of it, we're not interested in talking about nuclear waste in ways that fuel apocalyptic tales about failure, such as the one at WIPP. Apocalyptic narratives offer totalizing endings to our story as humans. When they tell stories of complete collapse, they reinforce the feeling that we have no obligation to act. When they tell stories of partial collapse, they encourage us to look for individual heroes or to become our saviors, or they reinforce desires for miraculous interventions or transcendence. With Look Only at the Movement, we try to tell a different story, and it goes something like this. We humans are one among many actants who affect the material conditions of life on this planet. We act always in complex assemblage with each other and with non-human things. The situation we are now in, our entanglements with the potent materials of the Anthropocene, will be ongoing for the rest of our species' existence. Instead of telling apocalyptic tales, we can use aesthetic practices to ask, how will we coexist with and in the new material forces of the Anthropocene? Instead of transcendental endings or calculated answers, we offer entanglement. Instead of springing our imaginations out of the ongoing prediction of being human on this planet, we pay attention to the call of some salient material facts. Facts such as, species on this planet have finite lifespans and material biological limits. Our planet is a continuous unfolding event of change, and we are living within a major event of habitat change. We are living in the midst of a species phase shift. Our species is crossing a threshold. The things we have produced as humans are signaling back to us. They are signaling to us the material limits of the human species. Making Look Only at the Movement is one of the experiences that brought us to a place of reassessing our studio work. We've just completed a decade of researching, designing, and making interactive events and devices to help us project our imaginations into deep geologic time, past and future. We have offered these events and devices to public audiences as cognitive and aesthetic aids for attempting to do what some say is beyond our capacities as humans, namely to visualize, interpret, and generally get our heads around the speed, scale, and forces of material geologic time. Our projects have taken a number of different forms: photographic image sensations, printed works such as posters, newsprints, booklets and field guides, and informal publication education events. But now, after a decade of making a body of text-based information and research-driven projects, we sense the necessity to take a different direction. We're taking a turn towards a performative, non-representational practice. We're doing this because we believe it's no longer possible to distinguish living the Anthropocene from making work about it. We suspect that the skill sets that we need now as artists and in humans that will enable us to work within the psychological and philosophical domains as much as within the art and design. What skills might aid us in inhabiting the psychological challenges of the Anthropocene without tipping into despair? What daily and aesthetic practices might assist us in accounting for our place within the Anthropocene? What gestures might we make to take account of the fact, as Timothy Morton puts it, the Anthropocene never stops sticking to you, no matter where you move on Earth. As yet, we do not have the skills to live the Anthropocene, especially in ways that are up to the task. For now, we've set ourselves into an informal project that we're calling Skill Sets for Living the Anthropocene. And as part of this project, a couple of weeks ago, we attended our first improvisational class. At this class, we stood in a small Brooklyn classroom with a group of 10 other students. Together, we tried to suspend control and experience what it can be like to not anticipate what should or even could come next. We simply tried to meet the next as it came. And we realized how many of our finely honed skill sets did not apply in this context. We couldn't think forward or design a witty response because we didn't know what was coming next, and the next action wasn't ours to take. The next action would come from someone who didn't yet know what they would be responding to. Improv demands that we respond to what arises, even if it's not what we expected or wish it to be. The inherent relational nature of improvisational play condemned or perhaps liberated us to interconnectedness. No action or words stand alone. You must listen closely. You must riff off of one another's responses. There's a pact at the core of this process. You agree to be in a mesh of human co-action. The process is essentially a meshwork. Together, this group tries to keep the metaphorical ball up in the air, moving, flowing, without letting it become captured by any one personal agenda or trajectory, or without letting it run out of energy and grind the process to a halt. We found ourselves acting, speaking, and moving in ways that were not graceful, were not polished, and in ways that we certainly did not expect from ourselves. And yet, these altered ways of being did arise from somewhere within and among us all. The process tapped our unexercised capacities to meet change collectively, even as it threatened to overwhelm us individually. Each of us had to act too soon, before sensations settled into habit or understanding. Paradoxically, bringing more personal energy to what is just now emerging demands that we be less self-absorbed. When we left the improv, we were reminded of Elaine Scarry's important book called Thinking in an Emergency. And in it, she shows that clear thinking and rapid action, or even spontaneous action, are not opposed to one another. It's possible to do both, to think in the midst of overstimulation and to take rapid, responsive action. But the ability to do both doesn't just happen. Like improv, you have to practice it. As Scarry states, emergency preparation depends on the willful instilling of deeply formed habits in advance of the catastrophe. The ability to act coherently in the context of great change has roots in habit, but actions that are incoherent or even dangerous in an emergency also have their source in habit. The habits that suddenly arise in an emergency, be they coherent, responsive, incoherent, and dangerous, may have been culturally received without self-consciously aspiring to acquire them. The Anthropocene certainly is an emergency, however slow-moving or distant it might appear from some temporary, fortunate locations. Thinking in the emergency that is the Anthropocene requires us to get more comfortable with meeting the unknown responsibly as a matter of habit. You might say that what improv was giving us was the skill of thinking while changing. As Scarry puts it, the world is changing more quickly than we can change. And as Smudge Studio, we're now thinking from within the midst of change itself. We're still in the early stages of this skill gathering for living in the Anthropocene, both as artists and as humans. Besides the improv class, we've attended the New York City State's disaster preparedness training, which is given to citizens of New York. We've participated in a Zazen meditation on New Year's Eve. But we are not Buddhists, we are not actors, and we are not emergency management personnel. But we suspect that one response that the Anthropocene is calling for is a remixing of culturally instilled habits, actions, emotions, and presumptions, a loosening of fixed senses of self-identity. And we've come to suspect that one of the most urgent and rewarding aesthetic challenges to us as artists and humans lies in the question that we're taking up in our current work. What reinvented daily practices might strengthen our capacities to think within the massive and fast changes that are the Anthropocene, and to live those changes in ways that are life-enhancing. Timothy Morton points out that neither panic nor the impulsion to act right now are capable of meeting the need to think within massive and fast change. Panic or impulsive action certainly aren't practices for meeting change in life-enhancing ways. Morton writes, there's this global warming, there is an ecological emergency. The melting world induces panic. This panic and the impulsion to act now is a problem philosophically and otherwise. Paradoxically, while we absolutely have complete responsibility for global warming and must act now to curb emissions, we're also faced with the various fantasies about what it means to act right now. One fantasy is the misunderstanding that forceful action equals meaningfulness. Perhaps what the Anthropocene is teaching us so strictly right now is that the quality of action matters. And it seems as though we don't yet have the skills to acknowledge our place within this mesh, or live the finitude of our place within this mesh, with a quality of gracefulness. Perhaps acting now requires actually being with the now, rather than being with the future, or being with it elsewhere, in dreams and fantasies, states of justice, or technical solutions. To pause, to think and contemplate in the midst of fast and massive change is a radical act of being with the world while not in a state of distraction. To pause can be a practice of coexisting with the uncertainty briefly. A pause can be a practice in taking in this emergency of uncertainty. A practice for learning before proceeding. If we act now on the basis of habitual assumptions, political analyses, senses of self, we run the risk of repeating, do-looping, or retweeting what we've already done. We risk defaulting into outmoded, complicit legacy knowledges out of desperation or habit. Rereading Morton and Eileen Scarry, we've come to imagine that perhaps we need to embody hybrid identities and skills as we improv our way through the near future. There's so much we, as singular identities, don't know. As artists, we have new hybrid practices to imagine and invent if we want to live in the Anthropocene responsibly and improvisationally, and we have a lot of practicing to do. Many Americans believe that nuclear waste is an issue confined to the remote western states of the United States. But in the final two encounters with nuclear waste that we present and Look Only in the movement, they did not happen on remote western roads. They took place in the suburbs. One is called Edison Woods, and it's located in northern New York State, adjacent to the Knowles Atomic Power Lab. Knowles is a 1,700-acre site of bustling activity where nuclear reactors are produced to power submarines for the US Navy. The other suburban tract is under development just outside of Denver. It's marketed under the name of Condolas. The cul-de-sacs of its yet-to-be-built homes run along 6,400 acres of the former Rocky Flats nuclear weapons production facility. Condolas, shown on the left, and Edison Woods, shown on the right, may be separated by nearly an entire continent, but they are deeply conjoined. At both sites, human domestic life and activities exist in intimate proximity to the potent byproducts of the nuclear complex. You could say that the still active Knowles plant in New York today is fulfilling the future that Rocky Flats could have had if it hadn't been closed because of numerous leaks and accidents. You could say that the now aging homes of Edison Woods stand as an eerie premonition of the future for the new houses of Condolas. Condolas looks out onto leveled, fenced-in, a so-called wildlife refuge that has been removed for all time from human use. Does the view of the future from Edison Woods mirror the views from Condolas today? Breaking form in the last minutes of the video, we stream our movements through Condolas on both screens. Look Only at the movement becomes a visual cul-de-sac. It refuses an ending. Instead, it turns towards the future that will certainly take shape even as they are uncertain from here. The nuclear material that is the focus of Look Only at the movement is too vibrant to be named or understood merely as waste. It is a continuous unfolding event of material change. It is a dynamic vector of biological impact. Its consequences ramify, accumulate, and stake claims on human future attention and resources. We are now passing along the entangled cul-de-sacs of the contemporary conditions of material life on our planet. Binaries such as life and death, beginning and end, safety, danger, past, future, constructive, destructive, these are dropping out and dropping away. By looking only at the movement of nuclear waste through and as landscape, we gained a sightline into deep geologic time. That sightline gave us access to an unexpected image sensation, namely that this most abject human-made object and material of the Anthropocene is something to which we are intimately related. You could say that the whole project of Look Only at the movement attempts to make one question thinkable and sensible. What does it take for two human beings to acknowledge, turn toward, and briefly move with the material realities of the Anthropocene and the material forces that are simultaneously of us and far beyond us? And we think it takes practices. Last summer, we experimented with practices for walking ourselves and audiences through an inner space that is hard to traverse. As guest researchers for a project called Future North, based in Norway, our job was to seek out sites and events above the Arctic Circle where forces of change are unfolding with particular intensity and palpability. Continuing our turn towards practices, we used the immediacy of digital media to slow down and pay deep attention to the forces of change itself. As we did with Look Only at the movement, we devised ways to move with the forces of change in the North and make work from them. We wagered that the lively ultra-world of Future North that is in the midst of emerging right now would catch up with us and gesture back. And today I want to end by presenting one of the practices that we devised as a way to receive and respond to what we experienced as gestures of the Anthropocenian North. The work consists of a text-based piece that we've called Turning at the Limits of the World. The words that compose the piece can be read as notes to self about what it takes to turn into the Anthropocene. They can also be read as instructions for others who might want to adapt and perform this practice that it enacts. And the words function as something of a manifesto for living in the Anthropocene. Turning at the limits of the world is one response to the fact that the Anthropocene is a historical outcome of the breaching of limits. And as a practice, it enacts an acknowledgement of the fact that humans have acted in ways that are unattuned to our own material, technological, cultural, and psychological limits. So I offer Turning at the Limits of the World as a practice for performing an embodied acceptance of our human finitude. I'll end then by reading the full text of the piece, accompanied with image sensations from our performance of our own turns at 2 sites of field research for Future North. Make a deliberate intention to meet forces that compose a limit of the world. Take this to be an obligation. Before setting out, invent a practice for turning at the limits of the world, because once you arrive, you will not be able to think abstractly or act directly. Set out for a geomorphological edge. Do research. Find a geomorphological edge where human and non-human forces converge and delimit one another. Define the route, timing, mode, support, and affordance of travel to that edge. Each of these will prove to be highly consequential. Arrive. You will arrive only for the first time once. Feel the forces of this place for your own brain, mind, and body, not as represented in guidebooks, research, others' photos, or habitual assumptions. Retune the media. Make them able to signal what the forces of edginess disclose here. Choose or reinvent media on the spot. Make media capable of attuning to the forces at play at this particular moment and edge. Use them to signal the edginess that is being delivered at this place by geomorphological materials and human and non-human events right now. Use the media to signal what is being disclosed here. Locate the site moment of going no further. Collaborate with the forces that are in the midst of remaking and making the limits of the world here. Sense how the forces indicate when and how they deliver limits here. Use the media in your brain, mind, body to sense when and why you will declare just enough and turn. Pause there. Coexist with the zero and the infinity that is your declared turning point. Coexist with the zero and the infinity that is your human and non-human limit. Experience a long exposure like a photograph. Let impressions accumulate via any means you choose. Perform the turn. This is not a defeat. Declaring just enough and turning at the limit is not ever turning back. Rather, to turn here is to inflect your own movement in response to addressing and being addressed by the limits of the world. It is a heroic act to encounter and to take in the limit of the zero, its full stop. Your act of turning can be a ritual. Most definitely, your turn is a gesture to address the stranger of the limit that is arriving here. Your turning is a highly consequential act. Not to turn here would have significant consequences. Your turning here also has significant consequences. The only thing that you cannot do here is live in this zero infinity. The turn and the turning point is not livable. It's unlivable because it is always and only the transition itself. The turning point is the transiting, the transit, the transformation. It is change itself. You cannot inhabit or know the turning point. You can only pass through it. The passage is the work, and the passage is the practice. Return a difference. It is a heroic act to encounter and to take in this particular fact of the physical universe. That to turn is to generate and to live a difference. To turn is to acknowledge a limit and to live by that limit, but with a generative difference. To turn at the limits is to generate potential and open the future. It is to perform the winding up and the letting go into difference and surprise. What is returned by this practice is a difference. A difference is the gift that your turning offers back to the world. It's a bow to the fact that the world is a continuously unfolding configuration and reconfiguration. A bow is a turn, it is a waveform, and with this practice, you bow to the difference that the limits of the world make in yourself and in the world. The gesture of turning and bowing returns you to the interlocking material reality that is you plus the limits of the world. Thank you.